Have you ever heard of Samson, the most feared man in the Bible? The one whose strength was so supernatural that no enemy dared to face him, but who had a shocking and surprising end. His story is full of mysteries, challenges, and powerful lessons that speak directly to our lives today. If you've ever felt trapped in a difficult situation, or that opposing forces are trying to bring you down, you'll find in this journey a path to understand how divine strength can act in you, even in the face of failures and difficulties. Before continuing, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications that way. You won't miss any details of the story that will transform your faith and your vision of strength, consecration, and God's plan for your life. But be careful, Samson's life was not just about physical strength, but also about a true spiritual battle, full of decisions that change his destiny and the destiny of Israel. What if I told you that the secrets of the Nazirite vow, the angelic visits, and even the conflicts with the Philistines hold valuable lessons for you? Then stay with me, because at the end of this series, you will see your own life with different eyes and discover how to walk towards your greater purpose. Israel was going through one of those times when it seemed to have forgotten where it came from and where it was supposed to go. After years of walking with God, the people simply drifted away, exchanging the sacred for practices that displeased the Lord. And as happens with anyone who strays, the consequences came. God allowed the Philistines, a powerful and ruthless Pleito, dominate the land for 40 long years. For decades of oppression is no small feat. Imagine growing up seeing your parents subjugated, your resources controlled, and your freedom limited, all because the people turned their backs on God's purpose. During this dark period, the Israelites lived in constant fear. It was like walking on eggshells, never knowing when the Philistines would impose another burden or carry out another injustice. Israel's identity as a chosen nation seemed to be erased. The people had forgotten their consecration, their calling, and had settled under the yoke of oppression. The Philistines knew this and took every opportunity to stifle any sign of resistance. It was a desolate scenario in which even the strongest felt weak. But it is precisely in moments like these that God begins to write the most surprising chapters of history. When all seems lost, he raises someone unexpected at an unlikely time with a plan that no one sees coming. And it was in this environment of spiritual darkness and national crisis that God began to prepare the birth of a liberator, someone with supernatural strength, capable of shaking the enemy's foundations, someone separated from the womb under the vow of Naziritship with a divine purpose. It is important to understand that Israel's suffering was not meaningless. God does not act on impulse, he works with purpose. The oppression of the Philistines was a kind of harsh school, a time of awakening. Often, when everything seems to fall apart in our lives, it is because the Father is calling us back to the center of his will. And as we will see below, even in the chaos, God was already moving the pieces for something great. And it would all begin with an unexpected heavenly visit. In the midst of all that oppression and spiritual silence, God chose an unusual place to begin his response, a barren woman from the tribe of Dan. She had no name, no children, and no status, but it was precisely to her that the angel of God appeared. Nothing could be more symbolic, right? God loves to take the unlikely and make it the instrument of his plan. And the angel did not come with a simple greeting. He brought a powerful revelation that woman would give birth to a special son, a Nazirite of God from womb. This was more than a birth, it was the beginning of Israel's liberation. This boy's consecration would be no ordinary one. He would be born under the vow of Naziritship, which involved clear and exacting rules. The angel instructed her not to drink wine or strong drink, to avoid unclean foods, and never to cut the boy's hair. This was not just a list of dietary restrictions, but a mark of separation. It was as if God were saying, this will not be an ordinary man. The Nazirite vow represented an entire life dedicated to the Lord body, soul, and mission. And even before he was born, this baby already carried an eternal purpose. It is curious how God begins great revolutions in the most silent places. While all of Israel cried out, or not even that, a simple woman in anonymity received an angelic visit with instructions about life and destiny. God's angel was not there just to inform, but to transform. And perhaps this is a point for us to reflect on how many times do we underestimate small beginnings? Sometimes God's answer begins with a detail, a conversation, a visit, a simple piece of guidance that changes everything. The barren woman was now the bearer of a promise. And get this, Samson's calling didn't start with him, it started with his mother's obedience. Even before the supernatural power, the Spirit of God, manifested itself in him, there was already an environment of consecration being formed around his life. This reminds us that God's plan does not ignore processes. Consecration precedes action. Preparation comes before war. And when the Lord wants to raise someone up, he begins by shaping the environment, even if it doesn't seem to make sense yet. And this was just the first step in something much bigger. After his wife shared the angelic visit, Manoah was deeply touched, and that says a lot about him. Instead of doubting or scoffing, as many would do, Manoah decided to pray. That's right, an ordinary man, in a time of oppression, crying out to God for guidance. And his prayer was sincere. He asked God's angel to return and confirm everything and teach them how to raise that special boy. Isn't this an example of how we should react to divine promises? It's not enough to receive the revelation. We must seek wisdom to live it. And God, who does not despise a humble and willing heart, responded. The angel returned not to Manoah, but once again to his wife. An interesting detail, don't you think? Perhaps to remind her that she was an essential part of that calling, not just a passing channel. As soon as she heard this, Manoah ran to the place and, before the angel, asked questions full of reverence. How should we care for the boy? What will be his mission? His concern for his son's purpose shows us how much he understood the seriousness of that consecration. The Nazirite vow was not just a ritual, it was a pact with God. Manoah, in his simplicity, wanted to offer a banquet to the heavenly visitor. He did not yet know that it was an angel, and this attempt showed the sincere hospitality of his heart. But the angel refused the food and instead asked the Lord for a burnt offering. That was when things got serious. As he offered the sacrifice, the angel ascended into flames of the altar, disappearing before their eyes. Can you imagine the scene? It is not every day that one sees an angel ascend into the fire of a sacrifice. At that moment, Manoah came to his senses and exclaimed, "We will surely die, for we have seen God." The wife, with wisdom and calm, responded with something that applies to all of us to this day. If the Lord wanted to kill us, he would not have accepted our offering, nor shown us all this. What practical faith! They had just witnessed a supernatural manifestation, but they were still firm, with their feet on the ground and their hearts in heaven. The angel's confirmation brought more than just instruction, it brought a sense of mission. From that moment on, they knew they were involved in God's plan for the liberation of Israel. And the next step would be to see this promise take shape in the birth of Samson. And then came the great moment, the birth of Samson. The woman, obeying all the instructions given by the angel of God, gave birth to a boy who was different from the beginning. The name Samson carries the idea of little son, and indeed, he came to illuminate a dark phase in the history of Israel. He was not just another baby among the people. He was a Nazirite, consecrated from the womb, with a defined mission to begin the liberation of Israel from Philistine oppression. Every detail, from his name to the way he was raised, pointed to the divine plan in motion. Samson grew up like any other child in appearance, but he carried something that ordinary eyes could not see. The Spirit of God was already beginning to manifest itself in him. This does not mean that he went around performing miracles while still a child, but there were clear signs that the hand of God was upon him. Can you imagine raising a child with that expectation? Every step, every word, every action, everything observed with the awareness that there was a divine purpose involved. And it was not a small purpose. It was something grand, involving the entire nation of Israel. The interesting thing is that Samson was not raised in an environment of war or military training. He was shaped by the obedience of his parents and by the Spirit of the Lord. And this shows us something very important. When God calls us, he himself takes care of equipping us. It is not just about physical strength, which Samson would have had in abundance, but about spiritual sensitivity, divine guidance. His supernatural strength would come over time, as the Spirit of God worked, and not as a result of human training or genetic inheritance. This beginning reminds us that God's calling does not always begin with noise, fame, or power. It often begins in the silence and obedient home, in a simple home, with parents who take seriously what God says. And Samson, even while still young, was already an active part of God's plan. His story was just beginning. But the first seeds had already been planted, and soon his strength and destiny will be put to the test. Because when a consecrated man moves, even the most feared enemies begin to tremble. When Samson grew up, his first big move away from home was controversial. He decided to marry far so good, but to a Philistine woman. That's right, to someone from the people who had been oppressing Israel for 40 years. Imagine his parents' shock. They immediately asked, "Isn't there a woman among our people? Does it really have to be a Philistine?" But Samson was convinced. The most interesting thing, the Bible reveals to us that although it seemed like a wrong choice, this was part of God's plan. Yes, the Lord was behind all this to create a conflict with the Philistines. This decision by Samson shows us how the divine plan sometimes moves in unexpected ways. In human eyes, he was making a mistake, disobeying spiritual guidance. After all, marriage with foreign women was forbidden in order to preserve the covenant with God. But behind this bold and seemingly wrong choice, God was setting the stage for a series of events that would shake Philistine rule. It is as if the Lord used Samson's impulsiveness as bait to lure his enemies and begin to act within the oppressive system. Of course, this does not exempt Samson from the consequences of his decisions. The fact that God uses a mistake to accomplish a purpose does not make the mistake acceptable. Here is a great lesson. Even when God acts in the midst of our stumbles, he still expects obedience. The vow of Nazirite required total separation, not only from food or haircuts, but also from alliances that compromise holiness. And Samson, in this regard, was going against all of that. Yet the Spirit of God continued to work in him because there was a greater purpose at work. This episode reminds us that life with God is not always black and white. There are times when the Lord moves in crooked ways, using difficult situations to open unexpected paths. Samson did not know all that was to come, but one thing was certain: his choice of Philistine wife was not just about love, it was about confrontation. A conflict was brewing, and soon the entire Philistine structure would feel the weight of the supernatural force resting on this man. And it all started with a forbidden marriage. On one of his trips to visit his future Philistine wife, Samson had an unusual encounter. A young, ferocious lion came roaring at him. Now, think about it. Any normal person would have run away or at least screamed for help. But with Samson, it was different. The Spirit of God came upon him with power, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as if it were a young goat. No sword, no weapon, just his bare hands and a supernatural force that came straight from above. This was not training. This was the Spirit working through someone consecrated. It is important to note that Samson did not tell anyone about his deed, not even his parents, who were nearby. This attitude gives us a clue about his profile: a strong man on the outside, but full of secrets on the inside. Perhaps he was still processing what had happened. Or perhaps he understood that this was a foretaste of what was to come: the conflict with the Philistines. The lion may well symbolize the enemies that surrounded him. And God was saying, if you obey me, there is no force that can stop you. It was just the beginning of Samson's strength being released. Days later, when he returned the same way, Samson went to check the lion's carcass. And what did you find in there? A swarm of bees and a honeycomb. Strange, isn't it? Honey inside a dead body. But he didn't just Luke reached in, grabbed the honey, and ate it. And what's more, he gave it to his parents without telling them where it came from. But there's a very serious detail here by the Nazirite vow. He could not touch anything dead. That was a clear breach of commitment to God. Small? Perhaps. But it was a crack in the wall of consecration. This episode teaches us that not all sweetness comes from a holy place. Sometimes something may look nice, but its origin is impure. Samson was already flirting with disobedience, even though it seemed harmless. Eating the honey was more than a slippy pit, was a seed of disconnection from God's purpose. But as we will see in the next few steps, God was still with him, guiding everything toward a greater outcome. The lion fell, but the greatest challenges were yet to come. When the day of the wedding banquet arrived, Samson was in enemy territory, surrounded by Philistines, but with his chest puffed out. As was customary, a great banquet was held, filled with food, drink, and much conversation. And it was there, in the middle of the celebration, that he issued a curious challenge, a riddle. The bet was simple. The guests solved it. He would give them 30 precious garments. If not, they would have to give them to him. It was a game, yes, but also a test of intelligence and, why not, a veiled provocation to the oppressive people of Israel. The riddle? Out of the eater came food, and out of the strong came sweetness. An enigmatic puzzle even for us today. Imagine for Philistines. No one there knew the story of the lion and the honey, so the riddle seemed impossible. For 3 days, the guests scratched their heads and argued among themselves, but could not solve it. This was the beginning of not just a game of words, but a premonition of what the coexistence between Samson and the Philistines would be like: tense, competitive, and always on the verge of explosion. That riddle was just the initial spark. What Samson did not expect was that by messing with Philistine pride, he would light the fuse of betrayal. The guests, upset at the possibility of losing the challenge in the precious garments, decided to play dirty. They went to Samson's wife, pressured her, and threatened her. Things got serious. They said that if she did not get an answer from him, they would burn her alive along with her father's house. A simple game now became a matter of life or death. And, as we will see, betrayal knocked on the door. This moment shows how Samson, despite his supernatural strength, was not always discerning of the spiritual environment around him. He was surrounded by enemies, but he acted with naivety. Yet God was allowing it, because each step brought Samson closer to his true calling to free Israel. The riddle was not just about the lion and the honey, it was about the mysteries of God's plan unfolding amid the chaos. And the consequences of this game were about to change everything. The pressure on Samson's wife increased with each passing moment. Overcome by fear and the threat of the Philistines swore to kill her and her family if they did not obtain the answer, she found herself in a distressing dilemma. On one side, her strong and mysterious husband, who trusted her; on the other, the violence and cruelty of her enemies. And so, amidst tears and distress, she decided to give in, pressuring Samson to reveal the riddle that, until then, he had kept as a precious secret. Betrayal? Yes, but also a reflection of human fear and fragility. When Samson, trusting in his wife's love and fidelity, finally gave the answer, the Philistines celebrated as if they had won a war. They used the answer to solve the riddle and, of course, demanded the reward, the 30 precious garments. There, at that moment, Samson felt the weight of betrayal, a feeling that few know, but that can tear the heart. It was the first great emotional wound he had suffered, not by an enemy from outside, but by someone close to him, part of his own home. But this wound did not stop at pain. The Spirit of God, which had already rested upon Samson, manifested itself in a new act of strength and justice. Indignant, he rose up and set out for revenge, killing 30 men of Ashkelon to recover his clothes and show that the Philistine people would not go unpunished. This reaction shows us that even when we are betrayed, we do not need to remain passive in pain. We can react with strength, as long as we are guided by the Spirit and with a defined purpose. Finally, Samson left the party, furious and disappointed, and made a decision that would mark his entire life. He left his cheating wife. The breach of family trust reinforced how betrayal can destroy bonds, but it also set the stage for the greater conflict that would come between him and the Philistines. Every step of the story, even with disobedience and mistakes, was aligned with God's plan to free Israel, and the battle was just beginning. After all the confusion at the banquet, Samson's wife's father made a decision that made clear his disregard for their previous ties. Without even asking his daughter, he gave her to one of Samson's companions. Just imagine Samson's shock when he found out that the woman he had chosen, against his parents' wishes, was now in the hands of another. This attitude of the father shows how much the Philistines wanted to undermine Samson emotionally, even dismantling his family ties to weaken him. This episode also reflects a cultural and religious conflict. While Samson was raised to fulfill a Nazirite vow, keeping himself separate from pagan influences, his wife was treated according to Philistine customs, which did not respect the same rules. Giving her to another man is more than a simple exchange. It is a symbol of the rupture of Samson's covenant with his family and with God, a consequence of disobedience and a conflict between the two peoples. Furthermore, this attitude creates a domino effect. What seemed like a personal fight soon turns into an open war between Samson and the Philistines. The pain of personal betrayal begins to reflect the collective suffering of Israel, oppressed and humiliated by the Philistines. Samson, now with more reasons to fight, begins to see his role not only as a husband, but as the liberator of his people. Ultimately, this transfer of his wife is a milestone that shows how Samson's personal decisions were intertwined with Israel's national destiny. God was using his inner conflict to fuel a larger revolution. Every piece of the puzzle, even the painful ones, fit into God's plan to free his people from oppression. And Samson's story continued to unfold. With the loss of his wife and the betrayal he suffered, Samson did not stand still. What began as a personal feud quickly escalated into open conflict with the Philistines. He began to confront the people who dominated Israel, not only for revenge, but because God was using these events to begin the liberation of a nation. The 40-year oppression began to be challenged by a man with supernatural strength and divine purpose, a true instrument in the hands of the Almighty. Samson was not a traditional warrior. He did not command armies or follow military tactics. His style was direct, intense, and filled with the Spirit of God. When he felt provoked or wronged, his reaction was overwhelming. With each blow, he weakened the Philistines and strengthened the hope of the people of Israel. The conflict was not just physical, but spiritual. Samson represented God's plan for Israel to escape oppression, even if their journey was marked by disobedience. This beginning of confrontation shows a valuable lesson. Even in the midst of personal mistakes, God can use a person for great things. The vow of Naziritship, although not always respected by Samson, did not nullify the divine purpose that rested upon him. And when the Spirit of God manifests itself, circumstances may seem contrary, but the plan moves forward. It is an invitation to reflect on how our failures do not need to be the end, but a starting point for something greater. Thus, Samson becomes a symbol of deliverance in the midst of adversity. He is living proof that even with failures, we can be used to accomplish God's plan. The conflict with the Philistines was just beginning, and each battle was more than a physical struggle. It was a step toward hope and redemption for Israel. The outcome of this story promises to be as surprising as it is inspiring. As we follow Samson's story, we realize that he was much more than a strong man. He was an instrument of God in the midst of a time of oppression and conflict. His life teaches us about the importance of God's purpose, but also about how our choices and disobedience can influence the path we follow. How many times, like Samson, do we allow impulsive decisions or wrong relationships to distance us from what God has planned for us? Have you ever stopped to reflect on the vows and commitments you keep today? And more, how have you dealt with difficult situations and betrayals that have appeared in your life? Samson shows us that even in the face of failure and pain, it is possible to react with strength, guided by the Spirit of God, and seek freedom from what oppresses us. What actions can you take to better align yourself with the divine purpose and strengthen your faith, even in the midst of storms? Think about it. Your journey may be full of challenges, but also of great victories. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to continue exploring these profound lessons with me. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos, where we will reveal even more secrets and biblical teachings that can transform your life. Let's walk this path of faith, strength, and liberation together.